On August 4, 1979, the people of Guam voted on whether or not to approve Guam's constitution, and the people overwhelmingly voted no, with about 82% of the votes against the approval of the constitution. Many groups across Guam criticized the constitution, including the Guam Bar Association and the Chamber of Commerce, but no other group vocalized their criticism and opposition to the Constitution as much as the CHamoru activist group, the Para Padat Coalition. Para Padat had a significant role in influencing the people to vote against the Guam Constitution, emerging as the most well-known CHamoru activist group at the time, Guahusi Pulan, and we will explore the initiative leading to Guam's Constitution and why Para Padat was against the approval of the Constitution. The initiative for a Guam Constitution began on September 9, 1975, when Guam Congressman Antonio Borja Wonpat introduced identical bills H.R. 9491 and H.R. 9492 in Congress, which called for a constitutional convention to draft a constitution for Guam. This was not Guam's first call for a constitutional convention, as back in July of 1968, the Guam legislature passed Bill 444, which became Public Law 9244, that called for a constitutional convention, otherwise known as Guam's first constitutional convention. However, unlike Wonpat's call for a second constitutional convention, the first constitutional convention did not seek to create a brand new governing document or constitution, but rather to revise the Guam Organic Act to better meet the island's needs under the unincorporated territorial status quo. Furthermore, Guam's first constitutional convention was not federally authorized. Wonpat believed that Guam should create its own constitution as a replacement for the outdated Organic Act in order to improve the self-government of Guam within the existing territorial federal relationship of the United States. This existing territorial federal relationship is the organized, unincorporated territorial political status quo. He acknowledged that the Organic Act served Guam well as it provided the form of government and degree of local autonomy warranted by conditions at that time. However, the Organic Act has had one basic shortcoming. It was enacted for the people of Guam and not by the people of Guam. Wonpat viewed the creation of a Guam Constitution as an important step forward in the 77-year political development of Guam as part of the United States of America. Wonpat made it clear in the House of Representatives that his legislation only dealt with the internal governing mechanism of Guam and not the existing territorial federal relationship. Quote, "Nor would this legislation alter the basic framework of the relationship between Guam and the federal government. What it does accomplish is to provide a deserved greater degree of self-government within this framework." Chairman of the Subcommittee on Territorial and Insular Affairs, Philip Burton, affirmed this in the hearing for Wonpat's bill, stating, "I would affirm that passage of legislation doesn't authorize, for example, the Virgin Islands or Guam to set up their own immigration laws or foreign policy or establish defense policies." Wonpat's companion bill, H.R. 9491, received several amendments to ensure that the Guam Constitution be drafted within the guidelines of Washington. Wonpat's bill was then merged with an identical bill introduced by Virgin Islands delegate De Lugo, H.R. 9460, calling for the establishment of a constitution for the U.S. Virgin Islands. De Lugo's bill, H.R. 9460, passed both chambers and became Public Law 94-584 on October 21, 1976. Public Law 94-584, also referred to as the Enabling Act, gave federal authorization to the legislatures of Guam and the Virgin Islands to call a constitutional convention to draft within the existing territorial federal relationship constitutions for the local self-government of the people of Guam. The law further required that such constitutions shall recognize and be consistent with the sovereignty of the United States over Guam and the supremacy of the provisions of the Constitution, treaties, and laws of the United States applicable to Guam, respectively, including but not limited to those provisions of the Organic Act of Guam which do not relate to local self-government. Furthermore, such constitutions must provide a republican form of government, a Bill of Rights, a system of local courts. Finally, any proposed constitution must be approved by the President, Congress, and then must subsequently be approved by the people of Guam in a referendum. Immediately, the Enabling Act caused a lot of controversy in Guam, especially amongst the Special Commission on Political Status, the first official Guam governmental body to focus on Guam's political status. The Political Status Commission at WAMPAT clashed. The Special Commission expressed concern, and Guam drafted a constitution when the political status question remained unresolved. Furthermore, the Commission wanted the flexibility for the Constitution to address important issues concerning territorial federal relations, such as land, immigration, foreign affairs, transportation, and so on. Some members of the Political Status Commission were so frustrated at all the federal requirements and limitations in the drafting of a Guam Constitution that they called for a mini Declaration of Independence. However, WAMPAT maintained that the constitutional process as set out by the enabling legislation would not be the way to change how federal laws affect Guam, nor the political status. These major issues were outside the scope of the federal authorized guidelines and must be addressed separately another time. As WAMPAT stated in a hearing, it does not seek to alter Guam's relationship with the federal government. That is a distinct and separate issue when we in Congress will have to address ourselves in the near future. In short, what this legislation would allow is for the people of Guam to write a constitution and establish a government of their own choosing. Furthermore, supporters of the Enabling Act pointed to the results of Guam's first political status plebiscite held on September 4, 1976, where the option improving the present status quo received the most votes. The meaning of the improved status quo option was explained on the ballot, which included the potential that Guam should seek the right to draft its own constitution. They believe the plebiscite results legitimized the creation of a Guam constitution. Nevertheless, despite the criticism, in December 1976, the 13th Guam legislature, pursuant to the authorization from the Enabling Act, passed Public Law 13202, which established a constitutional convention through a nonpartisan election of delegates. 32 delegates were elected, including Carl Gutierrez, a Democratic senator who was elected president of the convention. Over the course of 6 months, from July to December 1977, the delegates worked diligently to draft a constitution within the guidelines of the Enabling Act. In early 1978, the draft Constitution of Guam was submitted for review to President Jimmy Carter and the U.S. Congress. Both President Carter and Congress approved the draft without any changes. Now, the Constitution needed to be approved by the people of Guam. The vote on the Constitution was to coincide with Guam's general election in November. Shortly after, the predecessor organization of PANDAT, named the Committee for a More Informed Vote on the Constitution, emerged and advocated for a delay in the Constitution vote so that the public could become better informed on the documents. Additionally, they proposed a separate election for the vote on the Constitution so the documents would not become entangled in the senatorial and gubernatorial bids in the general election, especially since the Constitutional Convention President Carl Gutierrez was running for governor. In response to the call for a delay, the legislature's Committee on Territorial Federal Affairs conducted a hearing on November 12th. The hearing lasted for 10 hours and resulted in a 2-1 vote in favor of postponing the election. Consequently, the date of the referendum was changed and it was scheduled to take place on August 4th, 1979. Before the vote, pro-constitution and anti-constitution groups formed. It was at this time that the most vocal anti-constitution group, the Para Panda coalition, emerged. Para Panda traces its origins to two groups that merged together before the Constitution votes in 1979, PARA and PANDA. PARA, People's Alliance for Responsive Alternatives, was a Chamorro language advocacy group formed by activists such as Robert Underwood and Hope Cristobal in response to the popular Guam newspaper Pacific Daily News, the PDN, refusal to publish Chamorro advertisements and notices without English translations. After championing Chamorro language issues, PARA turned its attention to the Guam Constitution and opposed its ratification. PANDA, the People's Alliance for Dignified Alternatives, was an advocacy group that opposed the ratification of Guam's constitution, founded by Marilyn Manabusin, Anthony Tony Leon Guerrero, and Bill Cumber. Initially, they called themselves the Committee for a More Informed Vote on the Constitution and helped to successfully delay the constitutional referendum. Both PARA and this committee organization decided to form a coalition since both groups opposed the Constitution, and they already knew of each other. In fact, Tony Leon Guerrero was a key member of PARA. So, to formalize the coalition and as a play on words to match with PARA, which depending on how you pronounce the word can either mean stop or for in Chamorro, Marilyn Manabusin and Tony Leon Guerrero renamed their organization to PANDA, which meant slap in Chamorro. They then came up with an English meaning for their acronym PANDA, People's Alliance for Dignified Alternatives. Thus, the Para-PANDA coalition was formed. The name literally meant stop, slap. Para-PANDA wanted to stop the Constitution because it did not adequately address Chamorro rights and maintain the unincorporated political status quo of Guam and was therefore a PANDA, slap, in the faces of the Chamorros. The Guam Constitution faced significant criticism, especially from Para-PANDA, which can be summarized into three main points. Firstly, critics questioned the decision to create a constitution before resolving Guam's political status. They likened it to putting the carts before the carabao. Historically, countries regardless of their size, such as the United States of America, resolved their political status first before drafting a constitution, because the political status determines the contents of the constitution. Since Guam is an unincorporated territory of the U.S., the Guam Constitution reflects this as the U.S. demanded that the Constitution be drafted within the existing territorial-federal relationship. Thus, ratification of the Constitution would maintain the political status quo. Secondly, how is this a constitution reflecting the will of the people of Guam when the Constitution must be drafted under Washington's guidelines? These guidelines effectively constrain the Constitution to not address the crucial issues: immigration control, Chamorro land ownership, transportation, and so on. These matters were considered outside the scope of the federal guidelines and thus cannot be addressed in the Constitution. Consequently, the final draft of the Constitution did not contain any provisions that resolved these crucial issues. The Enabling Act mandated Guam's Constitution to comply with all federal laws, including Guam's Organic Act. This is why critics claim that the Constitution was nothing more than another Organic Act, reinforcing existing limitations. Lastly, there was a fear that the United States would exploit the potential ratification of the Guam Constitution as evidence of Guam exercising its right of self-determination, which can be interpreted as an act of decolonization. This could provide a basis for the U.S. to request the removal of Guam from the UN list of non-self-governing territories. The consequences of such a move were to be that Guam would essentially lose its right of self-determination and be stuck in its unincorporated territorial status with the U.S. Hence, the slogan of Para-PANDA was to keep our options open, as they believed that the ratification of the Constitution would potentially close Guam's political status options. This precedence was established with Puerto Rico, as they were delisted from the UN list of non-self-governing territories after drafting their own federally authorized constitution. Additionally, this fear was realized for Guam when, for the very first and only time, the U.S. invited the United Nations Decolonization Committee to Guam to observe the constitutional referendum. Supporters of the Constitution countered by asserting that the Enabling Act presented guiding principles rather than limitations for Guam's constitution. They emphasized these principles were rooted in the desire of Guam's inhabitants to maintain close political ties with the United States, as expressed in the 1976 plebiscite. They argued that abiding by these guiding principles was essential if Guam intended to be politically close to the United States. It wasn't just Parapanda that criticized the Constitution. The Guam Bar Association critiqued the Constitution due to the provisions concerning the Guam Supreme Court. The Special Political Status Commission criticized the constitutional process because they felt that political status should be defined first and drafting a constitution should follow. In the period preceding the August 4, 1979 Constitution vote, the United Nations Decolonization Committee, which had been invited by the U.S., observed the referendum process and engaged with the people of Guam. These interactions with the UN had a significant impact on various individuals, including members of Parapanda, who became more knowledgeable and interested in the UN and its procedures. As Robert Underwood said, we had meetings with the UN delegation. Mr. Swai from Tanzania was a guy who was explaining this whole process that we didn't really know about, didn't understand. We really then started to say, wow, there's a whole other world out there. These initial interactions with the UN would later lead Chamorro activists such as Underwood to go to the UN to spread international awareness for Chamorro self-determination and Guam decolonization. However, amidst these developments, due to a misunderstanding of the UN and why they were on Guam, some former delegates of the Constitutional Convention and other proponents of the Constitution accused the UN delegation of influencing the votes by their presence on Guam right before the constitutional referendum, as well as the UN delegation allegedly telling the people of Guam what their political status options are as a non-self-governing territory. Carl Gutierrez said, "The whole committee is suspect." Some responded to the UN by expressing their loyalty to the United States and demanding Guam to be taken off the list of non-self-governing territories. Criticism was directed towards the UN regarding their presence to observe the constitutional referendum and their absence during Guam's 1976 plebiscite. In response, the UN explained that they were not invited by the US to observe the 1976 plebiscite, but they were indeed invited to observe the constitutional referendum. Parapanda dedicated extensive efforts to actively campaign against the Constitution. Its members tirelessly went from village to village, spreading their message and advocating against the Constitution. They employed various methods such as distributing flyers, broadcasting television and radio advertisements, and actively participating in Constitution workshop village meetings to express their opposition to the Constitution. On July 29, 1979, Parapanda's spokesman Robert Underwood outlined Parapanda's objections to the Constitution in the Puti'on Sunday News editorial. First, the enabling legislation was so full of conditions that what we are presented with is not a constitution but a new organic act. A constitution gets its authority from the people it governs, not an act of Congress. Second, it denies that Guam's people have political maturity and prejudices future discussion on political status. It maintains the status quo in terms of federal-Guam relations. Third, it does nothing to promote economic self-sufficiency, which is impeded by our present political structure and federal-Guam relationships. Fourth, it has too many legal flaws and inconsistencies, which will result in continual litigation. The problems in implementation will be enormous. We are faced with a document that does not address these crucial issues, but instead asks us to ratify the status quo. What will be said by the federal government if and when we decide that we should change these federal regulations? Sorry, Guam, you approved the Constitution and the conditions that went along with it. 3 days before the vote, a live televised debate took place before a panel of newsmen in the KUAM studio between anti-constitution and pro-constitution forces. Anti-constitution forces were represented by Parapada members, Robert Underwood, Berlin Manabusin, and Bill Colbert. Pro-constitution forces included the Constitutional Convention President, Carl Gutierrez, and the two Constitutional Convention delegates, Jim Underwood and Martin Beneventi. The Constitution proponents argued that the proposed Constitution was a product of free will, based on federal guidelines derived from the 1976 referendum on Guam's political status, in which the majority of people expressed the desire for status quo with improvements, which included the potential that Guam should seek the right to draft its own constitution. As Carl Gutierrez argued, we must realize in the 1976 referendum on status, the people chose to maintain close ties with the U.S. and to draft a constitution. On the other hand, Parapada contended that the Enabling Act authorizing Guam's Constitutional Convention imposed severe restrictions on the Constitution. Parapada claimed that the resulting Constitution closed the door on the island's future political status. As Robert Underwood said, it's like building a house first and then deciding where to put it. The effect of this document is that Guam agrees to be totally subservient to the federal governments now and in the future. Skepticism towards the Constitution was growing, even among the Guam legislature as well as among the commissioners. A Pacific Daily News survey indicated that most of the 15th Guam legislature had planned to vote against the Constitution, mainly because of the political status issue, and the majority of the commissioners did not support the Constitution. On the day of the constitutional referendum, on August 4, 1979, hundreds of Guam voters went to the polls. On August 5th, the results of the referendum clearly showed that the people rejected the Constitution. Out of a total of 12,548 voters, 2,233 voted for the Constitution, while 10,315 voted against the Constitution. A stunning 82% of voters rejected the Constitution. It was a major victory for Parapada, and they celebrated the results. With the defeat of the Constitution, Carl Gutierrez said that the Constitution was turned down not by what it had to say, but because of the status question. I maintain that the document is the best I've ever read. I would hope that a new Constitution would be drawn from the same document. This one is still good. Gutierrez said the Constitution's defeat should be a challenge to the legislature to take the bull by the horns and petition the U.S. Congress to get the status question decided. Republican Senator Cecilia Bamba said she had been expecting the document to fail. My vote had been no all along. I expected this. The UN mission reports on Guam cited the defeat of the Constitution was largely because the draft Constitution would have maintained the status quo. It was clear that the people of Guam wanted the political status question resolved before a constitution. Within 2 weeks of the Constitution's defeat, the legislature proposed two bills dealing with Guam's political status. The first bill, Bill 480, sought to establish a special committee to write a Federal Territorial Relations Act that would be voted on in 1980. The second bill, Bill 654, proposed a joint political status constitutional convention. On the night of the public hearing on August 16th concerning the two bills, both bills faced significant criticism from Parapada, among others. Parapada found the bill to create a Federal Territorial Relations Act too limited in scope and rejected the idea of a combined status constitution approach. Parapada argued that Guam should decide its political status through a plebiscite, and the option should not be limited to a Federal Territorial Relations Act. As a result of lobbying in parts of Parapada, both bills failed to become public law. In the aftermath of the defeat of Guam's constitution, a new issue would grab Pa'apa'a's attention. Guam leaders had decided to let Guam self-determine its future political status through a plebiscite vote. However, the question of who is the self and self-determination became the topic of passionate debate, with Pa'apa'a arguing that self-determination belongs to the Chamorros alone. The issue of Chamorro self-determination galvanized Chamorros, and as a result, Pa'apa'a reformed with members of the Guam Landowner Association and other Chamorro activists into one of the most impactful Chamorro activist groups in the 1980s, OPR, the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights. However, their story would be told in another video. If you liked and enjoyed the video, consider supporting me on Patreon so I can continue to produce more Pacific Studies contents. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on all notifications, follow me on social media at PulanSpeaks, and a special Tsuzus Masi to Patreon supporters Puti'on, Pim Limtiaco, and Sablan. Tsuzus Masi for watching, Guahusi Pulan, and Pulan has spoken. Esta.